A dark figure stands motionless, patiently watching a family home from a distant forest. The farmhouse windows glow with a warm light, with silhouettes of the family visible inside. Breaking the silence of the night with his footsteps in the snow, the figure starts to approach. Stopping at the barn door, the stalker takes one final look at the family inside and disappears into the shadows. But who was this figure? And what did this unsuspecting family have coming? This is the story of one of Germany's most baffling unsolved crimes. The Gruber family was known throughout the region of Bavaria. 63-year-old Andreas Gruber ran the farmstead alongside his wife Casilia, his daughter Victoria, and his two grandchildren, 7-year-old Casilla Jr. and 2-year-old Josef. The isolated farm, surrounded by thick Bavarian forest, stood as its own little world, 40 miles north of Munich. But the Grubers were no ordinary family. Andreas was deeply unpopular in town, known for his stern demeanor and violent outbursts. He had also served 1 year in prison for an incestuous relationship with his own daughter Victoria, who had moved in with him later in life, after her husband, Karl Gabriel, supposedly died in World War I, though his body was never recovered. The Gruber household held secrets, and it might have led to their demise. In September 1921, the first signs of something sinister appeared. The family's maid, who had served them faithfully for years, began hearing strange sounds within the house. At first, it was tapping inside the walls, as if something was moving between the wooden panels. Then came the footsteps from the attic overhead, growing louder each night until she could barely sleep. When she finally approached Andreas about the noises, he dismissed her concerns, but agreed to investigate. The old man climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, lantern in hand, illuminating the dusty corners, but found nothing. No footprints in the dust, no signs of intrusion, nothing to explain the persistent sounds that echoed through the house at night. Over the next few weeks, the maid's experience worsened. The tapping in the walls became more insistent. Sometimes rapid like knocking, others slow and deliberate. The footsteps above became louder and louder. Andreas would investigate each night, lantern in hand, but always returning with the same answer: nothing. Eventually, she had enough. She packed her bags secretly in her room, went down the stairs, and shocked the Grubers by telling them she was leaving. When they asked why, she only had one thing to say: "The house is haunted." Despite the Grubers' attempts to convince her otherwise, she left that day. Perhaps the last person to escape the fate that awaited the family. For 6 months following the maid's departure, the Gruber family struggled to find a replacement, especially as rumors of the haunted Gruber house spread at the local market. But the family had a bigger concern growing each day. Andreas himself had begun hearing the sounds. Andreas approaches his barn at dawn, then pauses mid-step. On the heavy wooden door, he notices fresh, deep, and violent gashes surrounding the lock. He leans in close, inspecting the damaged wood and metal. The cuts are deliberate, made by something heavy and sharp. Worried, Andreas scans the empty field surrounding the farm. The distant tree line and the lonely road between the farmhouse and the nearest neighbor. The farm's isolation suddenly feels threatening rather than peaceful. That afternoon, he walks the half-kilometer to his neighbor's property to ask if anyone had heard anything, but his neighbor's blank expressions confirm what Andreas already feared. As Andreas walks slowly back to his house, his eyes constantly move between the path ahead and the distant silhouette of his farm. Someone was out there with something in mind for the Grubers, and Andreas's ignorance terrified him even more. Andreas sits alone by the fire. The rest of the family have already gone to bed. The tapping is getting louder day by day, no longer just in the walls, but from everywhere, all at once. Andreas gets up, grabs his lantern, and carefully checks each room. When he reaches the attic stairs, he pauses. The footsteps above stop, as if whoever, or whatever, was there, listening. On his way back to his bedroom, he checks on young Kazilla. She's not there. He wakes his wife and daughter, and they search every room of the house, yelling out her name in desperation. Andreas looks around the barn while Victoria and Kazilla Sr. search the house again. After an hour of frantic searching, Andreas leaves the barn keys on the kitchen table, and the family heads outside into the bitter cold, slogging through knee-deep snow toward the forest. But right there, on the edge, they find young Kazilla, barefoot and wearing only her nightgown with a blank stare in her eyes. When they reach her, her skin is ice cold, but she isn't shivering. Victoria immediately wraps her daughter with her coat and asks what brought her out there, but the child's response causes more questions than answers. I don't know. When they return to the house, on the kitchen table is today's newspaper, but none of the family had bought one today. Someone else must have been there. On the first day of spring, an unexpected snowstorm blankets the entire region of Bavaria overnight. Andreas steps outside for his morning routine, walking through the heavy drifts. He pauses when something catches his eye. Footprints in the fresh snow. Clear, distinct tracks leading from the edge of the woods straight to the Gruber house. But there was something even more terrifying. The footprints only came toward the house. They didn't lead back. Someone had walked from the forest to the farmhouse and never left. Andreas scans the snow around the property. The footprints end directly at the house entrance. Panicking, he rushes back inside, securing every lock and bolt inside the house. He wakes the rest of the family, and they search every room, check every window, but to no avail. There is no stranger, no signs of forced entry, no explanation for the mysterious footprints. Andreas orders his family to lock the doors and keep them shut while he heads back toward the forest. Although he didn't want to admit it, he was scared. His usual confidence is gone. For the first time, Andreas Gruber, a man who prided himself on control, feels vulnerable. He pushes deeper into the forest, eyes fixed on the quickly fading tracks. But eventually, the footprints vanish. No starting point, no sign of their origin. It's as if they appeared out of nowhere. Andreas stands puzzled in the silent forest. His mind races, connecting the disturbing events, the attic noises, the strange newspaper, the damaged barn lock, and now these footprints. The isolated incidents form a pattern, a kind of threat targeting his family. He turns back toward home, but stops right before he reaches the house. His eyes shift to the neighboring farmhouse, home to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz and Victoria had a relationship shortly after her husband was declared missing in World War I. When Victoria became pregnant with Josef, Lorenz initially acknowledged paternity of the child. However, as time passed, he retracted his claim and refused to provide financial support, leading to bitter legal disputes with the Grubers. The tensions escalated when rumors began circulating about Andreas' unnatural relationship with his daughter, with some suggesting he, not Lorenz, was Josef's father. The financial obligations and public humiliation created a rift between the neighbors that never healed, especially on Lorenz, who struggled to financially recover afterwards. Andreas hesitates. He's not one to ask for help. especially not from Lorenz, but sometimes desperation overcomes pride. Andreas reluctantly approaches the door and knocks. When Lorenz opens the door, he has a look of surprise. He didn't expect Andreas to visit him, especially given their history. Lorenz welcomes Andreas inside, taking his coat and bringing him something to drink. Andreas struggles to explain at first, but in just a few minutes, his anxiety forces him to tell him everything. Lorenz listens, but doesn't appear spooked. He offers Andreas a weapon for protection, but he refuses. He didn't come for protection, just someone to hear his fears. He leaves quickly, trudging back through the snow to his terrified family. The next few days were no different. The Gruber household lived in never-ending stress. Every creak made them jump, every shadow seemed to move, and almost none of them slept more than a couple of hours a night. A short while later, on March 31st, a glimmer of hope came in the form of a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who appeared at the door with her suitcase. Maria had a familiar face to Andreas, but she insisted that they had never met before. He shrugged off the thought and welcomed her into the family home, relieved that they finally had some help. That evening, the family gets ready to sleep early for once. Maria settles into her new room. Victoria tucks baby Josef into bed. Young Kazilla is with her mother, and everyone else sits by the fire chatting, almost ready to call it a night. The peaceful snowy night creates the perfect cover for a figure to move silently across the moonlit farmyard. In their hands, a mattock, likely taken from the Gruber's own toolshed. Hanging from their belt, the keys to the barn. The figure pauses, watching the family inside, before approaching and entering the barn. Inside, the stalker deliberately creates noise, just enough to draw attention. Andreas, inside the kitchen, hears it first. He hesitates, then grabs his lantern. Reluctantly, he makes his way across the freezing yard to investigate. As Andreas steps into the dark barn, there's no time to react. The stalker swings the mattock with terrifying force. The blow catches Andreas in the face, sending him crumbling to the ground in a pool of blood. The attacker brings the weapon down again and again, each strike more personal than the last. Inside, Kazilla Sr. grows weary, as her husband hasn't returned for a concerning amount of time. Grabbing her dressing gown, she follows his footsteps to the barn. She enters, calling her husband's name, only to feel a cold breath on her neck before the mattock silences her forever. She falls beside Andreas, their fingers almost touching in death. Victoria follows shortly after, the most brutal attack of all, leaving her unrecognizable. Young Kazilla, tearful and frightened, searches the house before venturing into the cold night. The barn door creaks, a sound, perhaps her mother. The last thing the child sees is the moonlight glinting off the blood-soaked mattock. In the eerie silence that follows, the killer methodically arranges their work. They stack the bodies of Andreas, Kazilla Sr., and Victoria like firewood, a grotesque display of their handiwork. But the night's work isn't complete. With the barn door closed ajar behind them, they turn toward the main house, the mattock dripping a trail of the Gruber's blood across the snow. Inside, the killer climbs the stairs. They enter Maria's room and watch over her as she sleeps peacefully, and she continues to sleep peacefully even when the killer's mattock comes down in her face, giving her a painless and instant death. The killer's footsteps make the floorboards creak as they do the unthinkable and enter the final room that has baby Josef, barely 2 years old, asleep in his crib. The killer raises the mattock, pauses, and hesitates for a second, but remorse is not something they brought with them, making him the final victim of the horrific Hinterkaifeck murders. 4 days later, a repairman arrives to fix the Gruber's feeding machine. He can see lights on inside, but no one answers his knocks. The family dog, who had been eerily silent until this point, is barking inside. After waiting for over 10 minutes, the repairman decides to go ahead and fix the machine outside himself. As he reaches the machine near the back door, he sees the dog. But this time, outside in the yard. Someone had let it out, yet the back door is locked tight. Confused, the repairman leaves the property and heads to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house. The repairman relays everything to Lorenz, who goes with him over to the Grubers. They find all the doors in the house securely locked. Well, all except one, the door to the barn. Lorenz stands outside the barn, calling out Andreas and Kazilla's names. They don't answer. Lorenz looks at the repairman and hesitantly pulls open the door to the barn. The stench hits him first, metallic and sickening. The repairman covers his nose with his arm and Schlittenbauer starts coughing. But then, as their eyes adjust to the dimness, they both step back in unison. There, stacked like firewood, lie the bodies of Andreas, Kazilla, and Victoria Gruber. Their faces are unrecognizable, beaten to a bloody pulp. Police arrive at Hinterkaifeck within hours. They case the crime scene, starting with the barn. They examine every inch of the house, walk through the entire property with the police dog, but they find no trace of the killer. The brutal murder of an entire household sends shockwaves through the community. An investigation begins. The case eventually goes into the hands of detectives, who discover even more disturbing evidence. The killer didn't flee after the murders. For 4 days, someone lived in the house with the corpses. The cattle had been fed daily, meals were cooked in the kitchen, smoke rose from the chimney as the fireplace kept burning. Someone had been sleeping in the beds and using the Gruber's own food, even letting the dog out when he barked. Even stranger, none of the money or valuables inside the house were touched. Cash stacked there in plain sight, ignored by the killer. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. More than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain a dark echo in German history, a perfect storm of horror, isolation, and unanswered questions.